Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is the Ukraine War Frontline update for the 5th of February 2024. Sorry that I haven't done a Frontline update for about 3 days now. This is probably the longest I've gone without a Frontline update for the best part of a year and a half. Yeah, really do apologise about that. It's just insanity in terms of busyness at the moment. A weekend full of, family stuff and what have you. And JR has done the mapping today. What an absolute legend. Catching up after several days of no mapping from myself. So thank you to him. As you can see, it is really quite a mixed bag of nuts on the front line. My general thoughts, a kind of overall feeling, would be that things are particularly tough for the Ukrainians. If you don't know what the lines to my map means, please pause the video and check out the key there. Things for the Ukrainians are tough, particularly in certain areas. In other areas, looking slightly better than maybe it was a few weeks or months back. So, okay, let's go and look at some changes. First of all, this is one that was missed. So some Russian gains rather than, being an attack over the last few days. Deep State Maps here showing a gain that we just missed previously. More in line with what Syriac Maps has to the northwest of Avdiivka up in that northern area. When we look at the ISW, Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank of this area, they say a Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group reportedly unsuccessfully attempted to cross the international border in Sumy Oblast on the 3rd. Ukrainian Joint Forces Commander Lieutenant General Naev reported on the 4th that Ukrainian forces engaged in small arms and artillery engagement with a group of 10 Russian servicemen on the outskirts of Hlukivska Hromada on the Ukrainian-Russian international border in Sumy Oblast and unsuccessfully pushed the group back into Russia. And that is detailed here. Tim White said there's been a fierce battle on Ukraine's northern border where a scout and sabotage group had tried to cross over from Russia. Ukraine released these photos. They say the battle in Sumy region lasted 90 minutes before the invaders were forced back across the border. And what this would be an attempt for the Russians to do, sorry, I started in Kupiansk area, but actually we're going to go to the Sumy area. I don't know exactly where that took place. Apologies on my behalf, but somewhere around this northern border, they have pushed in. The Russians have tried to push in, and of course that means that the Ukrainians have to throw some resources up to the border area. And in fact, that's a pretty big border, and you don't know exactly where the Russians are going to attack, or even if they are going to attack at all. Then you have to kind of at least somewhat defend this entire stretch, and of course that means pulling troops from other places on the front line. So this should be a pretty sensible thing for the Russians to do. Just have a couple of little attacks, into little raids into Ukraine, and that will keep the Ukrainians on their toes, exactly in the same way as what I said before. When the Ukrainians were on the counterattack, the Russian volunteer Legion and Corps and whatever were doing their own little attacks on that northern border to keep the Russians on their toes, so that they had to commit forces there and not to their defensive duties further down the front line. So both sides have tried that one out. Right. When we come back to the Institute for the Study of War, there is activity in a number of places right up and down that northeastern axis. Spokesperson for the Ukrainian Steel Border Detachment, Ivan Shevtsov, observed that Russian forces have nearly doubled their artillery fire along the Kupiansk-Liman line since late 2023 because weather conditions on the front line allowed for the intensive use of artillery and drones. Shevtsov added that Russian forces are unlikely to be experiencing ammunition shortages given the increase in shelling, and are largely attacking in the Kupiansk direction with infantry. Ukrainian Eastern Group of Forces spokesperson Yevlash, however, stated on the 2nd that Russian forces have almost halved their daily rate of artillery fire in the Kupiansk and Liman directions due to poor weather conditions and unspecified issues. In other words, bit of a contradiction there, some conflicting claims coming out from the Ukrainians that they are either doubling or halving their artillery use, the Russians indicating anything really. I would probably suggest that they are giving the Ukrainians a hard time along this axis. I think the Russians might be sensing that with all the political shenanigans going on back in the US and aid for Ukraine struggling to get through to the front lines in terms of particularly artillery ammunition, that now could be as good a time as ever for the Russians to try and make hay while the sun shines. So I would, I mean, again, what do I know, right? But for me, if you're looking forward in time, Ukraine are only going to get more provision of equipment given what Europe is doing in terms of ramping up, but that takes a long time to come to fruition. And so you've got this kind of gap between where the Americans have been unable to get short-term kind of aid packaged onto planes and sent over to Ukraine, and as a result the Europeans have had to say, right, we need to ramp up now. So you've got this lag where the Russians might think now's the time to attack in a number of places, even though the Russians themselves might not be in the best position to do so. They might not be flush with troops, trained troops. They might not have much equipment themselves. They might still be struggling to get artillery ammunition from places like North Korea and to manufacture it themselves. They might be firing at their production rates. So be it. It could be wise for them to choose to attack now in as many places as possible. I don't know. And we see here that they are continuing, according to Surrey maps, to attack in the Yampolivka direction to the west of Crimea, and they are kind of leveling out this front line. Andrew Perpetua not quite in agreement yet with those claims, a little bit further ahead of Deep State map as well, but that's where the Russians are supposedly fighting towards. In fact, in Andrew Perpetua's live stream from the other night, he was talking about whether he was going to increase his mapping around Yampolivka, because there are some reports coming out that the Russians are putting on a lot of pressure there. As Surat Maps here says, the Russians continue advancing towards the Zherebets River, and troops are now 1.5 kilometers from Yampolivka. So not too far. They've made some fairly decent gains there, as according to that source. Right, now we're moving on to sort of Bakhmut area, Bakhmut down to Kurdyamivka here. In fact, this is obviously from a few days back, by the way, as you can see here, the 2nd of February. Just trying to, as I say, catch up. Here we have Bakhmut into Bodanivka area. The Russians are trying to pressure, but the Ukrainians have regained control over the strategic position in Bodanivka, pushing the Russians back 500 to 1,000 meters. And I think that's what I reported the last time I spoke to you, which is probably around a second. Two previous positions. Battles inside the settlement are ongoing. Ukrainian forces are having an advantage at this point, is the claim there. And then we have some more action further to the south. So anyway, as we come out and come down to Bakhmut, you can see in this northern area a bit of clarification there north of Bodanivka. No changes to Bodanivka, but this is an area where the Russians have been pushed back a little bit over the last few days. Indeed, the ISW here then goes on to say geolocated footage published on February the 3rd indicates that Russian forces recently marginally advanced north of Klishivka. So as we come down past Bodanivka and Kromova, we come to this area north of Klishivka. The idea is that geolocated footage suggests that the Russians have pushed a little bit to the north of Klishivka. Active hostilities on the southern flank of Bakhmut. Attack of the armed forces of the Russian Federation by an infantry unit on the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine near Klishivka. Clearing positions, capturing servicemen. So some Ukrainian soldiers captured here by all accounts. And that position is located, as according to that source, here. So again, I wouldn't say that indicates this is the ISW doing their funny, marginal advances when that is behind Russian lines. And that footage, therefore, could be from some time ago when they did indeed move through there and take that. But, I think I would have reported that maybe 2 weeks ago plus now. maybe even more. Now, this is something JL was contacting me about. So, yeah, this is exactly what we're expecting is happening. Deep State Map is reducing the Russian control in that trench area north of or northwest of Klishchiivka. And this is that area, remember, the trenches that overlook Klishchiivka. We have the high ground behind Klishchiivka that looks down on that town, which has now been pretty much obliterated, as according to drone footage. This trench area on top of that high ground is the key to Klishchiivka. There's no point fighting over the rubble down below. It's all going to be about fighting for this trench area. Now, Suriyat Maps said that the Russians took control of it several weeks ago now, and there's never been any evidence really to support that. Andrew Perpetua, somewhat more conservative, saying that there's control over half of it, but they are fighting over that. Now, Deep State Map has removed even some more of that to indicate that possibly the Ukrainians are pushing them back. Possibly it's a clarification, but it has been a long time in coming. I imagine there is some pretty stiff fighting going on there. A couple of areas here where Deep State Map has adjusted accordingly. So anyway, I just thought that was pretty significant. And indeed, Bakhmut to Kurdyamivka area here. What seems like a small advance, but this is a really big one. Russians got kicked out of a stronghold northeast of Kurdyamivka, forcing them back to the outskirts. Ukraine now holds a very favourable position. So this is slightly further to the south of where we just are now. Moving back, past that, I'll come back to that in a second. This is this Kurdyamivka area there, which we did show a change, as according to, I think, Suriyat Maps showed that the Russians had been pushed back in that area. So that's confirmation from no reports there. And then we have some changes here, actually, to the east of Klishchiivka, north of Avdiivka, with the Ukrainians gaining some territory by those lakes that come down by the railway line that goes north-south there. I think that's fairly significant if that's true. This has come from Suriyat Maps. Situation south of Bakhmut during the last week. Positional battles between the two armies continued around Klishchiivka without significant changes. Important to note that Ukrainian troops are still trying to maintain a foothold on the other side of the railway, adjacent to the ponds north of Avdiivka. So some small gains there. And that's, as I say, good news for the Ukrainians. This is possibly one of the areas, like I said at the beginning of the program, that the Ukrainians are having more success at, more so than they were some weeks back, when it was looking that the Russians were going to get increasingly close to Chasiv Yar, and indeed Klishchiivka was, very tenuously controlled by the Ukrainians still. But it's looking better there now than it was previously. Then Suriyat Maps has quite a large change here to the area by Avdiivka. It's around Pivdene, south of these really tall tailings heaps, if you remember. Here we have those high tailings or spoils heaps from mining taking place that the Ukrainians supposedly took control. Well, they definitely took control of them. They put a flag at the top of one of those. I don't know if they still are in control of them. It's more likely grey zone. Or you can see that Andrew Perpetua has it grey zone. Suriyat Maps has that under control of the Russians. And then further down here, actually, that one pin there covers quite a lot of ground, really. The situation in Avdiivka is that the Russian army recaptured the trench previously lost 5 days ago. That's a significant regain for the Russians, if that is indeed the case. Right, so now we'll come out of there and go to Avdiivka, where we can see a welcome bright yellow pin for the Ukrainians up in the northwest of Krasnohorivka along this railway line. Some clarification or rejigging, or it could be a counterattack, who knows, for Deep State Map, as the Russians aren't quite as far forward as originally thought. We'll go to a few of the sources about Avdiivka. Interestingly, there's not a great deal in the ISW. Now, it probably could be because I've missed a couple of days. There's probably some stuff in there from the previous 2 days that I just haven't had a chance to look at. The only one is geolocated footage published on February the 3rd indicates that Russian forces recently advanced along the H20 highway east of Avdiivka. Right, we'll go and look at some of these sources about Avdiivka, and I've got quite a lot of sources concerning Avdiivka because some are saying it is very precarious there at the moment. It's not so much about closing the neck of the cauldron like I was worried about some months ago when the Russians were really trying to push around Krasnohorivka, around the Terikon here, and also up towards Severny in this southern area. They did try that, but they just lost phenomenal amounts of vehicles, equipment and troops, and gave up on that, and have actually had more success in going through both the kind of, I guess, north of the city, directly north of the city, and then south and southeast of the city. And here we can see an awful lot of pins to suggest that the Russians have made gains, particularly in this northern area around the quarry here. There was I think this settlement where there was a house around there somewhere that they were keeping control of. I can't remember that. I think could it have been there. Anyway, I'm not too sure. The Ukrainians and with the back against the quarry, I think you're going to be saying goodbye to that. Although Andrew Perpetua still has this as a grey zone here. We have Surat maps and Deep State showing that actually the Russians are controlling a vast amount of territory between Kamyanka there and the coke plant, with Andrew Perpetua showing that the Russians have taken control of these dachas in the north here. So a little bit of difference between the mappers, but what we can take away from that is the Russians are certainly pushing hard. Euromaidan Press said Avdiivka situation is critical there. Street fighting has erupted. Russian forces have advanced into Avdiivka's built-up area with street fighting underway, according to two prominent journalists. We'll come to them in a second. After gaining a foothold in the south 2 weeks ago, Russian forces have advanced and entered Avdiivka from the north over the past few days. Butazov and Sapelyenko both say the situation is critical. So those are the two aforementioned journalists. So here is the claim: Russian troops have advanced into the built-up area of Avdiivka. Street battles have taken place. Russian units have entrenched themselves on one of the streets on the northern outskirts of Avdiivka. If measured in a straight line, the advanced units of the enemy are a distance of about 1.5 kilometers from the entrance to the city. 2 weeks ago, the enemy managed to enter two streets on the southern outskirts of the city. The situation is critical. 110th Mechanized Brigade, as well as several attached units, are engaged in battles with an enemy that is several times superior in strength and is constantly applying fresh reinforcements to its infantry. So if you remember, I did a live stream with Greg Terry, who is in Ukraine at the moment. I'll be visiting him somewhat soon, and he was saying that it is, from his contacts on the ground, that it is really critical in actually, he said it's all over in Avdiivka. He said it's game over Avdiivka. The Ukrainians are being outgunned considerably. He was talking, or the people he was talking to was saying, and this could be exaggeration, and likely is, but 100 to 1 in terms of artillery fire and just the amount that the Russians are bringing to bear there. So the Avdiivka urgently needs fresh reserves and rotation of units of the heroic 110th Brigade that remains in control despite absolute exhaustion for almost 2 years of continuous fighting in the city. Ammunition is also necessary. Supplies are also extremely small. The enemy has a great advantage in means of destruction, so it's getting constantly hit with massive aviation bombs. The weak point is, as always, the interaction and order of application of all forces and means at the level of operational tactical management lies in reports at the general level. The desire to reassure oneself and not to annoy senior management with bad news are very harmful. I mean, this is a sort of criticism we see leveled against the Russian management from their own. So obviously some issues with the Ukrainians here if this is to be believed as well. And the top management wants to listen only to positive, not critical information. Therefore, there is no adequate response to changes in the situation. The enemy launched a real hunt for Ukrainian drone operators in the city. Any buildings and places where antennas are installed are subjected to artillery strikes and bombardment with guided aerial bombs. Russian aviation bombards virtually unhindered. At the same time, significant losses are borne by the enemy, and the advance is given to the enemy at a heavy price. But the enemy is concentrating reserves near Avdiivka much faster than the Ukrainian command. On Monday, my foundation will purchase a batch of control stations for Ukrainian drone operators of the 110th Brigade in Avdiivka instead of those destroyed as a result of shelling and bombing, and we will create stocks of antennas and control stations so that soldiers can immediately take spare equipment after being hit. So that is what he has to say of the area, it is particularly challenging. And then another chap says, today, according to my sources in Avdiivka, the situation in the city has become critical. Russian attack aircraft, taking advantage of the cloudy weather and the impossibility of high-quality aerial reconnaissance, entered the city from the northeast and the south, from the side of the Avdiivka quarry, to put it conventionally. They bypass the Ukrainian battle formations and entrench themselves in the buildings. This means that they are hundreds of meters away from the main logistical artery of the Ukrainian defenders. But the situation is not hopeless yet, say the military. If there are infantry reserves and experience of fighting in urban areas, the Russian breakthrough can still be eliminated, as it was 2 weeks ago in the area of the Tsarsky Ochota and Sobona Street. In fact, the fate of Avdiivka is being decided these days. So it is really touch and go. I mean, I think it is not looking good. And it might be that the Ukrainians have decided that, now's the time to pull out. It's done its job in attracting and fixing Russian troops and then attriting Russian troops and equipment. It's done that exceptionally successfully. All the stats are in for that. I mean, the verified losses of the Russians is phenomenal. Is it still worth the Ukrainians trying to hold on to it or not? And that is a question. Now, although some people kind of deny, there's some questions over this. There are claims that the M1 Abrams tanks are on the battlefront in Avdiivka. So there's video footage of that. So that's interesting because we haven't seen those near the front line yet. I'd be very interested to see if they are brought to bear. And here we have. I can't play you this video, but a massive explosion next to some troops driving along in Avdiivka. And this shows you the phenomenal destructive capability of the Russian aviation bombs and artillery and mortars that are just raining down on Avdiivka, causing the Ukrainian defenders to have a really hard time of it. The battle for Stepova is over, says Astrai Intel. So if you remember, Stepova is up here on the way to Berdichi. So they tried to close the neck around this northern area. They got beaten back. Stepova is still broadly a grey zone. And the idea is that, the battle for there is over. The battle for Avdiivka, though, has officially begun. Russian forces, having failed in their initial plan of taking the city into a pocket by achieving a breakthrough on the flanks, are now storming the city head on. Welcome to hell. And the idea is that Russian troops have advanced into built-up areas and entrenched themselves, as previously mentioned. Here we have Suret Maps' interpretation of what's going on. After the withdrawal of the Ukrainian army in the last 3 days, the Russian forces managed to occupy the northern shore of the Avdiivka quarry. In addition, as mentioned above, the Russian army pushed the front line to the railroad through the wooded area, reaching Sapronova Street 500 meters from the last supply line to the southern districts of the city. The events of the Battle of Avdiivka are accelerating with each passing day, and the battle is approaching the climax amid the indecision of the Ukrainian command whether or not to announce a withdrawal of forces from the important stronghold. So the claim there from Suret Maps is that there's been a bit of dithering from the Ukrainians as to exactly what to do, and the Russians have just kept pushing on. Now, the situation of the Ukrainian army in the city is getting more and more complicated. The Russian penetration from the north, says Suret Maps, is pushing the Ukrainian troops further and further to the west until the railroad, which is considered the last supply line in the last land supply line to the southern suburbs. Russian troops monitor Ukrainian movements throughout the area, further complicating supply and the arrival of reinforcements. So it's trying to push them back here to the railway line. And you can see where these points of contact are, most places. Some gains just here on the right for the Russians and some small gains for the Ukrainians down between Opitny and Spartak, just north of Spartak there, which is interesting because there are other claims that actually the Russians are gained there from people like Global War Monitor, but timing of these things is difficult. So you might have something that's coming like 2 days after the events, and in that time that place has been retaken by one side or the other. Meanwhile, the Russian army has intensified attacks from multiple axes, crossing the H20 highway and entering the forest area. And on the remaining axes, the Ukrainian troops have managed to repel the attacks, while the latest video footage confirmed that there are still Ukrainian soldiers in the former Air Defense Missile Battalion. Okay, so that is not a counterattack down there. this is exactly what we had expected previously, which is, so that's just down here, which is that Zenit, when Syriac maps claimed that Zenit was taken because of some faulty geolocation and the idea that there were some Russian human beings in the general area, and they're like, right, they're taking Zenit, said very clearly they will walk that back. You've got Andrew Perpetua, Deep State Map, neither of those agreeing that Zenit is under control of the Russians, and lo and behold, they're walking that back. That is not a counterattack, and a way, of course, that is couched here is kind of neutral. It's just like footage confirmed that there are still Ukrainian soldiers in the former air defense missile battalion. Rather than saying, by the way, I got it wrong, it's that's a tacit admission of a bit of overconfidence there. Clarification of Russian control on the south of Avdiivka, showing that actually around that area that we're just looking at, the Russians have more control, as according to Global War Monitor. But again, timing can be a little bit iffy. I mean, that was 3 days ago now. In Sarska Ohota, the restaurant area to the south, Russian claims of control of the district are overblown, as proved by FPV crews operating in the area with commentary. So there's some footage to suggest that actually the Russians don't necessarily control this area around here as much as they might claim, although Deep State Map still has them largely controlling that as well. Do Syriac Maps, Andrew Perpetua, much more conservative, having taken control back in answer to footage that has come out. So there is that. Syriac Maps then goes on down just south of Vodyane in Pervomaysky, or Pisky on the way to Pervomaysky. The Russian army took control over the southern dachas of Pervomaysky and then the Pons area. The battles have been moved to Persho-Travneva Street, which is the main artery of this locality, now under 40% of Russian control. So that's now further around here, over to there. So Deep State Map and Syriac Maps admitting that the Russians have made some gains there. Things are very difficult, aren't they? Deep State Map has some rejigs or clarifications in and around some of these other areas to the southeast of Avdiivka. It is looking pretty hairy around there, that is for sure. And indeed, this is one of the geolocations mentioned, well, this is the geolocation mentioned in the ISW that shows that the Russian forces have advanced. This is a defeat of Russian infantry and destruction of a Russian T-80BV tank. In this video, I can't show it to you, east of the city of Avdiivka, but I can show you where it was filmed, or where it's referring to, which is to the southeast of Avdiivka. Let's put that in there, or actually to the east of Avdiivka. Interesting. So, okay, this is the ISW showing possibly a gain for the Russians, but then if it is destroyed vehicles, then that would also suggest that the Russians have tried an attack across the road and have been repelled, is what that also shows. So I'm not really sure that does show a gain, but it's certainly in the grey zone. Well, it depends who you're talking about. So from Syriac Maps, that would show an advance from their controlled territory, but from Andrew Perpetua and Deep State Map, that's a long way into the grey zone. So that would possibly signify a geolocated advance, possibly in relation to those maps. So it just depends where you're starting from. Anyway, some activity over there. So it's, that therefore confirms that the Russians really are attacking right around the cauldron of Avdiivka. It must be super, super tough there. Horrific stuff. Yep, some minor advances in a field around Marinka. So that's to the top of Marinka there. As we come down past, or on the way past Marinka. So that's some claims, a little bit delayed probably from Global War Monitor, suggesting some gains there. Then we come to this area north of Novomykhailivka, where the Russians have made some fairly substantial gains, as according to Andrew Perpetua. And they have taken control over some really useful fortifications. These ones that are very well defended, built with earthen fortifications, but with significant sort of kind of rooms in them, and the full Monty as far as fortifications. That one there's video footage of that one being lost to the Russians, which is a real shame for the Ukrainians. These were very well fortified areas that obviously they just couldn't hold on to them. In fact, Andrew Perpetua talks about that in a video, so we'll just dip into that.
Russia posted a video of the assault on this position here, and they showed how these like seemingly mundane earthworks, like these earthen walls, they were hollowed out and turned into like kind of like a castle wall. Like the inside is hollow and you can like walk through it, and there's like bunkers and rooms inside. And Ukraine was using that to defend this whole area, but they were overrun and had to abandon it. So there's just a lot of things like that throughout this whole area. I believe these were all pretty similar. So, but yeah, Ukraine is just slowly losing all this ground. But Russia is also taking it at ridiculous costs. They've lost so much equipment and so much manpower to take these positions that it makes you wonder if they have the capability to keep going. Because again,
and that's the important thing. So land, in my opinion, at this stage, unless it's really tactically or operationally important land, as in, I don't know, something like Konstantinivka, I think is important, and it has, because of it's a hub, and it also means that this road down here can be taken, and Avdiivka goes, and this kind of whole area, control of this area means that they can use HIMARS to hit Mariupol. So stuff like that is important, but land that doesn't necessarily have that kind of value attached to it is just land, right? And so if they lose this area here, as long as they keep Novomykhailivka, to keep Paraskevivka, to keep Konstantinivka, as long as they keep Konstantinivka safe, then that doesn't have like huge amounts. I mean, it's all like buffer to buffer to buffer, so they have these knock-on effects, but it's land. So it's okay to concede land like that if you are exacting a cost from the Russians that is astronomical, and that is what the Ukrainians have done. So the silver lining to the cloud here is that in order to prevail in this war, the Ukrainians need to attrit the Russians at something like 3-1, 5-1, or more. Ideally, personnel and equipment losses to Ukrainian losses. And in this area, they've done that. There's enough geolocated, visually confirmed evidence of massive Russian losses in the same way that we have seen up in Avdiivka. So if Avdiivka gets lost, and like I've said with Bakhmut, I say the loss of Bakhmut was a gain for Ukraine, because it cost Russia Wagner for a start. It cost them Prigozhin. It cost them tens and thousands of troops, and not so much equipment, mechanized equipment. They didn't use a lot in Bakhmut, but Avdiivka is a different kettle of fish. They've lost the troops and the equipment, just phenomenal amounts. So if they eventually lose Avdiivka now, the Ukrainians can leave with their heads held high saying, we exacted a massive cost on the Russians and it would not have been worth it for the Russians. The same can be said around this Novomykhailivka area here, where they have just lost phenomenal amounts of equipment.
Novomykhailivka is not what matters. It's Konstantinivka. This is the town that matters. All of this is the buffer between, the important area and where they are. So this is all buffer. This is their defense. So obviously you don't want to defend the thing that you need. But yeah, so like losing these positions is not the end of the world, as long as Ukraine can keep Konstantinivka.
Absolutely.
And to the south, we've seen some things lately, haven't we?
Yeah, we have seen a lot of things.
Would you like to talk about them?
I mean, it starts with knowing that the Russians have occupied Solodka for, I don't know, a whole year or something like that. And still they managed to, assault out of it and get broken down pretty much immediately when leaving that town. That's how successful they were. But yeah, they lost another column there. I think 72nd destroyed something around 15, maybe more vehicles.
This attack was so silly. They just lost so much stuff. It's just so much. It just we couldn't even count all of this when we first got this. Like we needed more video to see. And in retrospect, you can actually say all the losses. It was just really hard to count them. Cause like this like you look at this, you squint and you're like, is that a vehicle? Maybe it's not. It's actually two. So that's two vehicles, and that's three vehicles. But it's hard to see them. This is another vehicle, that's a vehicle, that's a vehicle. Here's two. So it's just there's so many vehicles here.
So I let that play on because, again, it gives you the understanding that either they attack out of places. So this is Saloka here. So they attack out of a place and get absolutely hammered, lose 15 vehicles, and then back to where they started. Or they do that and take some land, but they take some land at the cost of astronomical cost to them. So the question is always, is it worth the Russians taking the land that they take? You know, is this a Pyrrhic victory? Is this what the Ukrainians want? Which is, yeah, you go and fall on your sword here, or fall on our sword. You know, you drive your columns of vehicles into the grey zone, and we'll absolutely hammer the crap out of them. Now, you imagine what Ukraine could do if they were given that $60 billion aid package, and this is where it gets really, really frustrating because, you know, yeah, it just not enough has been done to, I think, support the Ukrainians. The ISW in the area talked about, here we have it, geolocated footage published on the 4th indicates that the Russian forces marginally advanced northwestern Marinka. So I'm going to go back up again now just to say that stormtroopers, the Russians' 5th Brigade of the 1st Donetsk Army Corps captured Ukrainian positions in the Marinka direction. And so here we have where they have taken some Ukrainian positions, and that is why Suryat Maps has that increase there over and above what Deep State and Andrew Perpetua have. I don't know why there's continued difference there. That may get adjusted as the days go by, unless the Ukraine is pushing back, and that's why that has not been changed from the others. Anyway, when we come down to the rest of the front line, you can see no changes around the Vuhledar to Velika Novosilka area. Some deep state map clarifications showing Russian gains, but it's probably just a bit of clarification given new evidence coming out in this area that puts them more in line with other mappers. And then really we come over to Krinky, where there are no changes, but heavy use of, I think, aviation, claims of aviation from both sides in around that area. Here, no report says, confirmed, both private and Russian sources confirm Ukrainian advances in western Krinky. This is going back to the 2nd, so this is 3 days ago, while also gaining further control over supply lines in Dnipro and branches towards the left bank. So that's 3 days out of date now. So there could have been some marginal success around Krinky in taking a little bit of area there, but it must be insanely tough in that area. Anyway, that's the effectively 3-day update. Thank you for your patience in waiting for that, and indeed for watching this long video. Really appreciate your support. Take care. Speak soon.